Trump's 3 most controversial moves in 2026 so far. You woke up one morning in January 2026, poured yourself a cup of coffee, turned on the news, and the anchor said the words that made you put that coffee cup right back down on the table. The United States military had just invaded a foreign country in the middle of the night. They had captured that country's president, put him on a warship, and flown him to New York City in handcuffs. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was only the beginning. Welcome, sit down, get comfortable, because what we are about to walk through together, step by step, fact by fact, story by story, is not a movie script. This is not fiction. This is not some political thriller someone dreamed up in Hollywood. This is real. This is recent. This happened. And the world, quite literally, has not been the same since. My name is your guide through history as it is being made, right now, in front of all of us. And today, we are going to examine 3 of the most dramatic, most controversial, most consequential decisions made by President Donald Trump in the year 2026. 3 moves that have shocked allies, terrified enemies, divided Americans, and changed the geopolitical order of this entire planet, possibly forever. We are going to cover the military operation in Venezuela, a late-night commando raid that nobody saw coming, that toppled a South American dictator and put the United States in control of the Western Hemisphere's largest oil reserves. We are going to cover the war on Iran, an explosive joint military campaign with Israel that killed Iran's Supreme Leader, triggered a regional conflict that drew in countries across the Middle East and beyond, and has left the world teetering on the edge of something far larger. And we are going to cover the push to control American elections, a campaign by Trump to reshape how votes are cast and counted before the 2026 midterms, a move that Democrats are calling the most dangerous threat to American democracy in a generation. These are not small stories. Each one of these could fill a book. Each one of these deserves your full attention. And today, you are going to get the full picture. The background, the build-up, the moment it happened, the immediate aftermath, the global reaction, and the questions that are still hanging in the air, unanswered right now as we speak. So let's go. Let's start from the very beginning. Section 1, Operation Absolute Resolve, the capture of Nicolas Maduro. Let me take you back to a very specific night. The night of January 2nd into January 3rd, 2026. It is 2 o'clock in the morning in Caracas, Venezuela. The city is dark. Most people are asleep. And then, without warning, the sky lights up. Explosions. Not just 1 or 2, but a coordinated series of strikes hitting infrastructure points across northern Venezuela. Air defense systems, communications, military checkpoints. All of it targeted simultaneously, precisely, with overwhelming force. And in the chaos of those first moments, a team of Delta Force operators, America's most elite special mission unit, is already moving through the darkness toward a heavily fortified compound known as Fuerte Tayuna, Venezuela's largest military complex. Inside that compound, sleeping or perhaps already awake and terrified by the sounds outside, is Nicolas Maduro, the man who has ruled Venezuela with an iron fist since 2013. And next to him is his wife, Cilia Flores. They had no idea this specific night was coming. And yet, the United States had been planning this moment for months. Let's back up. Let's understand who Nicolas Maduro is, because to understand why this happened, you need to understand the man at the center of it. Nicolas Maduro came to power in Venezuela in 2013, after the death of Hugo Chavez. Chavez had been a polarizing, charismatic socialist leader who used Venezuela's enormous oil wealth, and Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the entire world, to fund social programs, but also to entrench his own political power, align Venezuela with adversarial nations like Cuba, Russia, Iran, and China, and systematically dismantle the country's democratic institutions. When Maduro took over, he took all of that and made it worse. Under Maduro's rule, Venezuela experienced one of the most devastating economic collapses in modern history outside of an actual war. Inflation reached levels so astronomical that people were using stacks of cash to buy a single loaf of bread. Grocery stores were empty. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Children were dying of malnutrition. By the time 2026 rolled around, nearly 8 million Venezuelans, out of a population of roughly 30 million, had left the country. 8 million people. That is not a migration. That is a mass exodus. That is a people fleeing a homeland that has been destroyed. And throughout all of this, Maduro clung to power. In 2024, Venezuela held a presidential election, and independent monitors, the Venezuelan people themselves, and opposition leaders all declared that the election was stolen. The actual winner of that vote, Edmundo Gonzalez, fled to exile in Spain, and Maduro declared himself the victor. The international community, including the United States, refused to recognize him. But he stayed in that palace because he had the military, he had the secret police, he had Cuba sending troops to guard him personally, and he had something else. He had drug money. Now, here is where the American story really starts. The Trump administration, from the moment Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, classified 2 Venezuelan organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. One was the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, a loose but deadly network of senior Venezuelan military and government officials who had allegedly been profiting from cocaine trafficking for years. The other was Tren de Aragua, a violent Venezuelan gang that had spread its operations across South America and into the United States, bringing with it extortion, murder, and kidnapping. Trump believed, and charged in federal indictments, that Maduro himself was at the head of this criminal empire, that he was personally directing the flow of cocaine into the United States. He doubled the U.S. bounty on Maduro's head to $50 million. That is not a symbolic number. That is the price of a man. Through the second half of 2025, Trump began turning up the heat. The U.S. Navy began conducting strikes on small vessels in the Caribbean Sea, claiming they were drug-running boats operating on behalf of Venezuelan criminal networks. The organization that monitors human rights in Latin America, WALA, documented at least 32 such military strikes between September 2025 and January 2026, with at least 115 deaths. The Trump administration countered that each strike, in Trump's own words, saved 25,000 American lives. Critics pointed out that no evidence had been provided that the targeted vessels were actually drug trafficking boats. Then came the oil tankers. The U.S. began seizing sanctioned Venezuelan oil tankers on the high seas. Then the U.S. struck a port facility in northern Venezuela. The pressure was constant. It was relentless. It was designed to tell Maduro one thing: we are coming. And in November 2025, something extraordinary happened. Venezuela's Democratic opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, the woman who had escaped Venezuela in December 2025 to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, met with Trump at a business meeting in Miami. She promised to open Venezuela's oil and gas reserves to American and international investment if Maduro was removed from power. And Trump listened, because Venezuela's oil reserves are not just the largest in the world. They are enormous beyond calculation. Experts estimate their potential value in the trillions of dollars. Meanwhile, the CIA was already inside Venezuela. A team of intelligence operatives had crept into the country and begun tracking Maduro's movements. They knew his routines. They knew where he slept. They knew what he ate. They watched him every day, building the picture that would make the operation possible. Trump approved the strike before Christmas 2025. U.S. troops built a mock-up of Maduro's compound at an undisclosed location and rehearsed the assault over and over. America's most advanced aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, swept into the Caribbean. Additional warships, carrying more than 4,500 sailors and Marines, moved into position. Trump said later, with characteristic bluntness, "A lot of ships out there," and Maduro saw those ships, but he still thought it was a bluff. Trump gave him one last chance. In a private phone call about a week before the operation, Trump told Maduro directly, "You have to go. Surrender now." Maduro, according to Trump's later account, came close. He hesitated, but then he said no. He stayed put. That was the decision that sealed his fate. On the night of January 2nd into January 3rd, 2026, Operation Absolute Resolve began. Delta Force operators moved on Fuerte Tayuna. The airstrikes neutralized Venezuela's air defenses. The electricity went out across large sections of Caracas. And in the chaos and darkness, Maduro's guards, many of them Cuban military personnel secretly stationed in Venezuela for years, not Venezuelans at all, faced the most elite soldiers in the American military. Most of them were killed, and Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, were captured. A Venezuelan official reported, in the hours after the raid, that at least 40 people had been killed in the attack, a number later updated to 80. Most of the dead were members of Maduro's presidential guard. 2 civilians were also reported to have been killed. Within hours, Maduro was on board the USS Iwo Jima. Trump posted the photo on Truth Social. Nicolás Maduro, the dictator, on an American warship. A day later, both Maduro and Cilia Flores were flown to New York City, walked off the plane in DEA jackets, and arraigned in Manhattan federal court on charges of narcoterrorism, cocaine importation conspiracy, and possession of machine guns. They both pleaded not guilty. At a press conference at his Mar-a-Lago estate with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Dan Kane standing beside him, Trump described it as, and I want to be careful to reflect what the public record shows, he said, one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might in history. He then said something that stopped journalists in their tracks. He said the United States would, quote, run Venezuela until a safe, proper, and judicious transition of power could take place. The United States would run Venezuela, a sovereign nation of 30 million people. Let that sink in for a moment. The immediate reaction around the world was intense. Venezuela's Supreme Tribunal of Justice declared acting president status for Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, who was sworn in as acting president on January 5, 2026. Rodriguez defiantly said Venezuela would never again be a colony of any empire. The Venezuelan military, however, said it would recognize her as acting president and called for a return to normalcy. The country did not collapse into full civil war, at least not immediately. The United Nations Secretary General said he was deeply alarmed. Democratic Senator Mark Warner, vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, asked the fundamental question that haunts the entire episode: does this mean any large country can indict the ruler of a smaller adjacent country and take that person out? That question does not have an easy answer, and it may not have one for a very long time. On the question of legality, Trump's Justice Department had prepared a legal opinion before the operation, a document from the Office of Legal Counsel that argued the operation would not rise to the level of a war in the constitutional sense, and that it would serve important national interests. The memo cited 5 separate justifications, including the severity of the drug trafficking charges against Maduro and the number of armed guards expected at the compound. Administration lawyers argued, essentially, this was a law enforcement action with military support, not a war. Critics, legal scholars, and many members of Congress from both parties disagreed strongly. Both the House and Senate considered resolutions under the War Powers Resolution to direct the president to remove American forces from Venezuela. The Senate voted to advance one such resolution, triggering what was described as a furious reaction from the Trump administration. But the resolutions were ultimately not passed into law. Trump pressured Republican senators to vote against them, and they largely did. In terms of what the operation actually achieved beyond removing Maduro, the picture is complicated. Trump said U.S. firms would develop Venezuela's vast oil reserves and recoup what he called stolen oil money. Secretary Rubio said an oil quarantine would continue while the U.S. led efforts to rebuild Venezuela's energy sector. Oil revenue, Rubio said, would support a 3-phase transition process. But experts noted that rebuilding Venezuela's oil infrastructure would require a long-term investment of billions of dollars, and the country's production had collapsed due to years of corruption, mismanagement, and sanctions. Trump also said Machado, the Democratic opposition leader who had been celebrated internationally, did not have the support to lead Venezuela, even as he scheduled a White House meeting with her. He compared the situation to what happened in Venezuela to the situation he wanted in Iran. Those words would prove prophetic in ways that the world was not yet ready for. And here is the thing that you must remember as we move forward in this story. Operation Absolute Resolve was announced on January 3, 2026. It had been just 3 days into the new year. 3 days. And the United States had already launched a military operation in a foreign country, captured its head of state, and declared that it would be running that country for the foreseeable future. And the world had barely caught its breath before the next crisis began to build. Because while Venezuela was still burning, Trump was already looking east. Section 2. The War on Iran, February 28, 2026, and everything that followed. There is a difference between a crisis that builds slowly and one that explodes without warning. What happened in Venezuela felt sudden, even though it had been months in the making. What happened with Iran felt like both at once. The tensions had been building for years, for decades, really. The enmity between the United States and Iran stretches all the way back to the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the hostage crisis, the seizing of 52 American diplomats who were held for 444 days. That wound never truly healed. And by 2026, it was about to be ripped wide open. Let's set the scene properly. Throughout 2025, Iran had been continuing to advance its nuclear program. Despite years of sanctions, despite isolation from much of the international community, Iran had been enriching uranium to levels that brought it very close to the threshold of being able to build an actual nuclear weapon. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, had long since collapsed. Trump had walked away from it during his first term. No replacement deal had ever been signed. And Iran, rather than pulling back, had been accelerating. In the summer of 2025, there had already been a first test of open military conflict between Israel and Iran. A 12-day conflict in June that allowed Israel to demonstrate its ability to reach inside Iran and strike. Israel's Air Force debilitated Iran's air defenses in that round and caused significant damage to Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure. The conflict ended when the United States, in a move that shocked military analysts, struck underground nuclear facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan using powerful bunker-buster bombs. Trump described it as a limited, one-off mission. But a subsequent intelligence report, which the Trump administration dismissed as politically motivated, assessed that Iran had moved much of its enriched uranium stockpile before the strikes happened, and that the facilities had not been fully destroyed. The assessment suggested Iran's nuclear program had been set back by only a few months. A few months. That is the terrifying number that hung over everything that followed. Through the fall of 2025 and into early 2026, Iran kept building. According to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Tehran was constructing missiles and drones to create what he described as a conventional shield for its nuclear weapon ambitions. Essentially, Iran was building a wall of conventional military power meant to deter any future strike on its nuclear facilities. At the same time, Iran's proxy forces, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, and armed militias in Iraq all remained active, funded and armed by Tehran. In January 2026, something dramatic began happening inside Iran. The Iranian people took to the streets in large-scale protests against the government. Protesters had long suffered under the repressive policies of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader who had held power since 1989 and had been the face of the Iranian theocracy for decades. In January, Iran's government cracked down hard on the protesters. There were beatings, arrests, executions. At some point, the Iranian government announced the execution of a 26-year-old protester, a move that enraged international observers. Trump was vocal about it all. He posted on Truth Social warning Iran that if it killed peaceful protesters, the United States would come to their rescue, saying he was locked and loaded and ready to go. He urged the Iranian people to take over their institutions, adding, "Help is on the way." Trump was briefed on military options. He held back. Briefly, simultaneously, his team, including envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, were conducting talks with Iran about a potential nuclear deal. Those talks failed. Iran refused to agree to the terms the United States was demanding. Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program kept advancing. And then, on February 6, 2026, Trump signed an executive order titled Addressing Threats to the United States by the Government of Iran. The administration was moving towards something large. In mid-February, Trump sent warning signals. He indicated publicly that the United States would not allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Period. No exceptions. No negotiations. The language coming from the White House grew harder, more direct, more urgent. On February 28, 2026, Trump posted on Truth Social and set out formally that Iran posed a threat to core national security interests of the United States. He said the U.S. had been unable to reach a diplomatic agreement with Iran to curtail its nuclear program. He said the Iranian regime was continuing to expand. And then he announced what had already begun. On the night of February 28 into March 1, 2026, the United States and Israel launched nearly 900 coordinated strikes in just 12 hours. The targets included Iranian missiles, air defense systems, military infrastructure, and, most devastatingly, leadership. Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had led the Islamic Republic for almost 37 years, the man who had overseen Iran's proxy network, its nuclear ambitions, its hostility toward Israel and the United States, was killed in the very first wave of strikes. Dozens of other senior Iranian officials were also killed. And then, in a moment that generated perhaps more international condemnation than any other single event in the conflict, a missile struck what appeared to be a girls' school adjacent to a naval base of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps east of Bandar Abbas. More than 160 people were killed in that strike. 160 people, many of them young girls. Israel immediately denied responsibility. The United States said it was investigating. An independent investigative group later released video suggesting the missile was fired by U.S. forces. The Trump administration disputed this. The question of who fired that missile remains one of the most contested and deeply painful points of the entire conflict. The international reaction was immediate and massive. The United Nations Refugee Agency reported that 100,000 people fled Tehran in just the first 2 days of the strikes. The Iranian Red Crescent, by March 7th, reported over 1,300 deaths in Iran, including civilians. Oil prices surged to their highest level since 2023. Countries across the Middle East found themselves being dragged into the expanding conflict. Iran struck back hard. Iranian retaliatory strikes hit countries hosting U.S. military bases, including Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. On March 1st, 6 American service members were killed in an unmanned aircraft attack in Port Shuaibah, Kuwait. They were members of the 103rd Sustainment Command. On March 7th, Trump traveled to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware for the dignified transfer of their remains, one of the most somber duties of any commander-in-chief. A 7th U.S. service member would later die from wounds sustained in the conflict. Israel continued striking Iran night after night. Hezbollah entered the conflict, launching attacks on Israel from Lebanon. Israel sent troops across the Lebanese border. Beirut's southern suburbs were struck. More than 100 people were killed in Lebanon in just the first days after Hezbollah's entry. An Israeli general declared that Dahiyeh, the Hezbollah stronghold in South Beirut, would look like Khan Yunis, a city in Gaza that had been decimated by Israeli bombardment. The U.S. military sank an Iranian frigate, the Iris Dina, in the Indian Ocean. Defense Secretary Hegseth announced it was the first time an American submarine had fired a torpedo at an enemy ship in combat since World War II. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi warned that the United States would bitterly regret the precedent it had set. The U.S. Embassy in Kuwait was struck by an Iranian missile. Secretary Rubio closed the embassy until further notice. Iranian missiles were intercepted over Turkey, a NATO ally. Qatar intercepted missile attacks and evacuated residents near the U.S. Embassy. The conflict was spreading actively, visibly, dangerously. Inside Iran itself, the death of Khamenei triggered a constitutional process for selecting a new supreme leader. An interim leadership council was established. And on March 8, 2026, that council elected Mojtaba Khamenei, the dead supreme leader's own son, to replace his father. Trump called the new supreme leader a lightweight and threatened he would not last long without his approval. Trump told Reuters he wanted to be involved in the process of choosing the person who would lead Iran into the future. He said he wanted someone great for the people and great for the country. Let that land for a moment. The President of the United States declared he wanted a role in selecting the next supreme leader of Iran. The same pattern he had established in Venezuela, where he said the U.S. would run the country and express skepticism about the Democratic opposition leader, was now being applied to one of the most complex and historically significant nations in the Middle East. The justifications offered by the Trump administration for the Iran war shifted considerably from the start. And through it all, through every missile, every diplomatic crisis, every grief-stricken family, the world asked itself the same question that had been asked after Venezuela. What comes next? Who fills the power vacuum? What does Iran look like the day after a war? What does the Middle East look like? What does the world look like? Those questions were still being asked as the guns continued to fire. As of the moment this script was written in early March of 2026, the war on Iran was still ongoing. The situation was still fluid, still dangerous, still evolving. History was not waiting for anyone to catch up. But even as that fire burned in the Middle East, back home in the United States, a different kind of battle was being waged. A battle over something that Americans have always considered sacred: the right to vote, and the question of who controls it. Section 3. Nationalizing the vote, Trump's battle over American elections. In a democracy, there is nothing more fundamental than the election. It is the mechanism through which the people express their will. It is the process by which leaders are chosen and held accountable. It is the heartbeat of self-governance. And in 2026, as midterm elections approach, President Trump has moved to fundamentally reshape how those elections work in the United States. And the debate over what he is doing has become, for many Americans, as alarming as anything happening abroad. Let's start with what Trump has actually said and done, because this matters. The facts are important here. Trump has called to nationalize federal elections. That is not a paraphrase. That is what he said. He has pushed for the Senate to pass a bill called the Save America Act, which stands for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility. This bill would require proof of citizenship to register to vote. It would require photo identification to cast a ballot. It would prohibit no-excuse mail-in voting, the kind of voting that millions of Americans, particularly elderly people, people with disabilities, and people in rural areas rely on. And it would end what is called ballot harvesting, the practice of collecting and submitting completed ballots on behalf of voters. Trump's position, as articulated by the White House, is that these measures are common-sense election integrity policies designed to ensure Americans have full confidence in the administration of elections. The administration has pointed to concerns about non-citizens voting and about the accuracy of voter rolls. But here is what the evidence actually shows. It is illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Cases of non-citizen voting are extremely rare. The FBI in January 2026 did seize ballots in Fulton County, Georgia, a county that Trump lost to Joe Biden in 2020, though the circumstances and findings of that seizure have not been fully disclosed at the time of this writing. Critics of Trump's proposals, including virtually every voting rights organization in the country and the entire House Democratic Caucus, argue that the requirements for proof of citizenship and strict photo ID would disenfranchise millions of Americans. Studies have shown that millions of eligible U.S. voters do not possess the kind of documentary proof of citizenship that would be required under the SAVE Act. These voters are disproportionately low-income, elderly, from communities of color, or from rural areas where obtaining official documents can be more difficult. House Democrats gathered at their annual policy retreat in February 2026 and described what Trump was doing as, in the words of one congressman, a five-alarm fire. They articulated fears that Trump could deploy immigration and customs enforcement agents and National Guard members to polling places as a means of voter intimidation during the November 2026 midterms. One lawmaker said the effort to counter these measures needs to be supercharged, on steroids. A pending Supreme Court decision on the Voting Rights Act looms over all of this. And Trump has indicated he is considering ways to impose his preferred election changes even if Congress does not pass legislation to enact them, potentially through executive action. There is also a broader context here. Trump has never fully accepted the results of the 2020 presidential election. He has repeatedly described that election as rigged, a claim that has been rejected by courts, by election officials from both parties, and by two official investigations. He has specifically suggested that non-citizens voted in large numbers in 2020, a claim for which no credible evidence has been presented. In early 2026, he began publicly revisiting these claims again, using language about the 2020 election that observers noted as a restarting of the same narrative. And there is this chilling context. The 2026 midterm elections will decide control of the House of Representatives. Democrats have a minority in both chambers right now. If they are going to change that, if they are going to gain the power to conduct oversight, to pass legislation, to check the executive branch in ways the Constitution intended, they need to win those midterms. And they are deeply alarmed that the rules of the game are being rewritten before the game is played. Democrats also noted a tension that they described as hypocrisy. Trump justified the Venezuela operation partly on the grounds that Maduro had stolen an election, had refused to honor the results of the 2024 Venezuelan vote, and had clung to power illegitimately. And yet, many of his critics say Trump himself has consistently refused to accept the legitimacy of elections he has lost. The parallel is uncomfortable, and it has not been lost on observers. At the same time, Trump supporters argue vigorously that election integrity is a legitimate concern, that the existing patchwork of state-by-state election rules creates inconsistency and vulnerability, and that requiring ID to vote is a standard practice in many other democracies around the world. They argue that mail-in ballots create opportunities for fraud, even if documented cases of such fraud remain rare. The argument over elections is, at its core, an argument about who gets to vote, how easily, and under what circumstances. And in a country as divided as the United States in 2026, that argument carries enormous stakes. Because whoever wins the 2026 midterms will determine the balance of power in Congress. And whoever controls Congress will determine what investigations are conducted, what oversight is applied, and what legislation can be passed or blocked for the remaining 2 years of Trump's second term. The battle over elections is not a distant, abstract policy debate. It is happening right now in state legislatures, in federal courtrooms, in Congress, and in the minds of millions of Americans who are watching these developments with a combination of passion, fear, and deep uncertainty about what their democracy looks like on the other side of all of this. Section 4. Connecting the threads. What does it all mean? We have now walked through 3 stories: a military raid in Venezuela, a war in Iran, a campaign to reshape American elections. And if you have been listening carefully, you may have already started to hear the connecting threads that run through all 3. The first thread is the extraordinary expansion of presidential power. In Venezuela, Trump sent in the military, overthrew a foreign government, and declared that the United States would run the country, all without a prior vote in Congress and all justified by a Justice Department memo that said it did not rise to the level of a constitutional war. In Iran, Trump launched nearly 900 military strikes in 12 hours, killing a foreign head of state, without a prior authorization from Congress. In both cases, Congress attempted to pass resolutions invoking the War Powers Resolution, which requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to hostilities and limits unauthorized military engagements to 60 days. In both cases, those resolutions failed to become law. Trump acted, and then Congress tried to stop him, and then Republicans in Congress largely sided with Trump. The president's authority to commit the United States to military action abroad has been expanded, in practice if not in law, to a degree that genuinely concerns constitutional scholars across the political spectrum. The second thread is the question of geopolitical order. For decades, the international community operated under a set of norms, not always followed perfectly, not always enforced consistently, but broadly understood. Norms that said you do not invade a sovereign country and kidnap its leader. Norms that said you do not launch massive military strikes on another nation without United Nations Security Council authorization or at least a clear, documented act of aggression against you. The United States itself built and championed these norms after World War II, when the devastation of that conflict led nations to establish the United Nations and international law as tools to prevent the world from ever again descending into global catastrophe. Trump's actions in Venezuela and Iran have fundamentally challenged those norms. And when the world's most powerful military says the rules no longer apply to it, the implications for every other nation, for every future conflict, for every future dispute are profound and unpredictable. The third thread is domestic politics. Every one of these 3 moves, Venezuela, Iran, elections, plays out against the backdrop of a deeply divided America. Trump supporters see a president who is finally doing what politicians always talked about but never did. They see a man who captured a drug lord, who struck at the nuclear ambitions of America's most dangerous adversary, who is fighting to make sure elections are honest. His opponents see something very different. They see a pattern of unchecked power, of international recklessness, of democratic erosion. And both sides believe, with genuine passion and genuine fear, that the future of their country depends on which interpretation of these events turns out to be right. And the fourth thread, perhaps the most human one, is the thread of consequences that extend beyond presidents and policies and politics, to real people in real places who are experiencing the reality of these decisions with their bodies and their lives. The civilians killed in Venezuela. The Cuban soldiers who died in a compound in Caracas. The children killed in Iran, including those at the school near Bandar Abbas. The 7 American service members who came home from Kuwait in flag-draped caskets. The 100,000 Iranians who fled Tehran in 48 hours. The millions of American voters who are being told the rules about how they can cast their ballot are changing. These are not abstract numbers. These are human beings with families and stories and futures that have been altered by decisions made at the highest levels of power. That is what it means when a president makes a decision. It does not just affect the headlines. It affects lives. Section 5. The world watching, international reactions, and what comes next. The world has been watching 2026 unfold with a mixture of alarm, calculation, and in some corners, grudging respect for American power. Let's take a tour of how different parts of the world have responded, because the international picture is essential to understanding the full scope of what is happening. In Latin America, the reaction to Venezuela was sharply negative among many governments. Nations that had maintained relations with Maduro, or that had simply watched Venezuela as a neighbor, looked at what happened and asked themselves whether the doctrine of national sovereignty, the idea that a country has the right to govern itself without external military interference, still means anything at all. The UN Security Council was convened. Condemnations were issued. But the United States, as a permanent member of the Security Council, faces no binding international penalty for its actions. In Europe, reactions were divided. France, the United Kingdom, and other NATO allies expressed concern about the legality of the actions, particularly in Iran, while also recognizing their deep security relationships with the United States. France ultimately authorized U.S. use of French military bases for defensive operations in the Iran conflict. The United Kingdom did the same, with the additional complication that the UK's RAF base in Cyprus was struck by an Iranian drone, bringing the conflict to NATO-adjacent territory in a deeply unsettling way. Spain, by contrast, denied use of its bases and faced sharp words from Washington as a result. Germany, under Chancellor Friedrich Merz, met with Trump in early March and maintained a careful diplomatic posture. NATO as an alliance found itself in the awkward position of supporting a member state, the United States, that had launched a war without collective alliance consultation or approval, against a country that had struck other NATO members' territory in retaliation. The precedent-setting nature of all of this is difficult to overstate. Russia watched with intense interest. Russia had been a major beneficiary of the Maduro regime in Venezuela, receiving oil deals and political alignment from Caracas. The removal of Maduro was a loss for Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere. But Russia was also watching Iran carefully. Russia and Iran had grown closer in recent years, particularly through their shared experience of Western sanctions and their alignment on certain geopolitical goals. The killing of Iran's supreme leader and the destabilization of Iran represents a significant blow to Russian strategic calculations in the Middle East. China also watched carefully. China had been receiving approximately 80% of Venezuela's crude oil exports under Maduro. The end of that arrangement, and the prospect of U.S. firms taking over Venezuela's oil sector, is a direct economic and strategic blow to Beijing. China condemned the Venezuela operation. It also condemned the Iran strikes. China's official position is always one of respect for sovereignty and non-interference, even as its own actions sometimes contradict those stated principles. But the deeper calculation in Beijing is about long-term power. A United States that is more deeply entangled in Venezuela and the Middle East is a United States that is also more stretched, more exposed, and potentially less focused on the Pacific. And Taiwan is watching all of this very carefully indeed. India, a country that has historically purchased Iranian oil and maintained important economic ties with Tehran, is navigating a complex situation. The war on Iran has caused Indian oil supply chains to be disrupted and has forced Indian diplomats into a delicate balancing act between their strategic relationship with the United States and their own economic interests. And inside the United States itself, the debate is fierce, emotional, and consequential. Polls show that Americans are divided along familiar lines, with Trump's base strongly supporting the actions in Venezuela and Iran and deeply concerned about election integrity, and those who oppose Trump alarmed by the constitutional implications of the military actions and deeply worried about what changes to voting rules might mean for the future of representative democracy. There are also unexpected voices in the conversation. Some conservatives, including members of Congress who generally support Trump, have expressed concern about the lack of congressional authorization for the military operations. Representative Thomas Massie, a libertarian-leaning Republican, argued that Trump started the war with Iran as a distraction from other political issues. Some supporters of Trump on foreign policy grounds nonetheless worry about what a prolonged military engagement in Iran might mean for American forces, for oil prices, for the economy, and for the global balance of power. And the big question, the one that hangs over everything, is what comes next. What does Venezuela look like in 6 months? In a year? The Trump administration has said it will support a transition process, but the details are thin and the precedents for successful transitions after U.S. military intervention are not encouraging. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. The United States has a mixed track record, to put it charitably, when it comes to managing the aftermath of military regime change. What does Iran look like? The country has a new supreme leader, one whom Trump has already declared he does not accept. The nuclear facilities were struck, but the question of whether Iran's nuclear program has been truly set back, or whether it will rebuild with even greater secrecy and determination, is one that intelligence agencies are already trying to answer. Iran's proxy forces, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias, still exist. They have been weakened, but they have not been eliminated, and they are angry. What do American elections look like in November 2026? Will the SAVE Act pass? Will Trump's executive orders on election rules survive legal challenges? Will the midterms take place under fundamentally different conditions than any midterms in modern American history? And whatever happens in those midterms, will the results be accepted? By everyone? By the president himself? These are not rhetorical questions. They are live questions being asked in real time with real urgency by real Americans who care deeply about the answers. Section 6. History in Motion, a Final Reflection. We are living in a moment that historians will study for generations. That is not hyperbole. That is simply true. The events of 2026, the first few months of 2026 alone, have been so consequential, so unusual, so precedent-shattering, that anyone who tells you they know exactly how this all ends is either very confident or not paying close enough attention. History rarely goes where we expect it to go. The leaders who seem invincible are sometimes toppled overnight, as Nicolas Maduro discovered at 2 o'clock in the morning on January 3rd. The conflicts that seem contained sometimes spread in ways no one predicted, as the Iran war has demonstrated by dragging in Kuwait, Lebanon, Yemen, and almost Turkey. And the institutions that seem permanent, the norms that seem unbreakable, the rights that seem guaranteed, sometimes turn out to be more fragile than we thought. Or sometimes they turn out to be stronger. That is the thing about moments like this. You cannot know until you are on the other side of them which way it went. What we can say with certainty is this. The decisions made in the first months of 2026 by Donald Trump, the 47th President of the United States, the first American president in history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, have changed the world. They have altered the political map of South America. They have ignited a military conflict in the Middle East that involves nuclear-adjacent powers and has drawn in NATO allies, Arab nations, and the global oil market. And they are reshaping the rules of American democracy in ways that will affect every citizen of the United States for years to come. Whether you believe these changes are necessary, whether you think they represent bold leadership or reckless overreach, whether you are filled with pride or with dread or with some complicated mixture of both, the fact remains. This is happening. It is real. And all of us, every single one of us, are living through it. There is one more thing worth saying before we close. In moments like these, it is easy to feel overwhelmed. It is easy to feel powerless. The decisions being made happen at levels of power that feel very far from ordinary life. And yet, the whole point of democracy, the whole point of the system that the United States and many nations have tried to build and protect, is that ordinary people are not supposed to be powerless. Ordinary people are supposed to be heard. Ordinary people are supposed to matter. So as you watch these events unfold, do not just watch. Pay attention. Ask questions. Demand answers. Read from multiple sources. Talk to people you trust. Engage with your representatives. Vote in whatever way remains available to you because it still matters. Because the history that is being made right now is not being made by presidents and generals alone. It is being made by citizens who choose to be informed, engaged, and present for the moments that define their era. We are living through one of those moments, and what we do with it, all of us, is still very much to be determined. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring enough to spend 120 minutes walking through this with me. The world is complicated. The truth takes effort, but it is worth it. Every single time. Stay informed, stay engaged, and we will see you in the next one.